it's with very great pleasure, and it's a great honor for us this evening to have Rabbi Dr. Berel Goldstein and his Rebbe, of course, with us. And we hope this will be the first of many visits here to this shul. I give you Rabbi Goldstein.
What a great delight for me to be able to be here myself this evening and to have the great honor of you chairing and hosting this evening. I didn't actually realize, Rabbi Kimchi, that you're a Talmid of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, and that of course adds to the significance of it, because actually you'll see that in my prepared remarks I actually wanted to begin with a statement from Reb Chaim Shmulevitz in one of his Sichos Musar, where he articulates a radical principle, and it's discussed in the book, because everyone, it's well accepted the concept of, it's well accepted the concept of derech eretz, the importance of derech eretz and of menschlichkeit, that everybody accepts. It's it's incontrovertible. If you look at the sources, Torah sources, in the Gemaras and the Midrashim, it's very clear. But Reb Chaim Shmulevitz takes it one step further, and he makes a statement which, on the surface of it, is really radical. And if he hadn't said it, I certainly would never have even dared to think of it, let alone say it in public. And it captures a very important part of the purpose of this book, because it's there to convey. The book is really not a book about history and geography, and it's not really a book about a particular group of Jews who happen to live in a particular part of the world. It's about the value system that the great Rabbonim of this Litvisha community taught. And it's that value system which is of course predicated upon the values of the Torah and all of the sources in the Gemara. So it's not a unique value system that pertained to just to them. They were drawing from all of the Torah sources, but it's what they chose to emphasize. And in the introduction to the book you will see that this is a book about emphasis, meaning Torah is a vast system. And so to talk about emphasizing one value over another sounds counterintuitive. We all know the Mishnah, that one should be careful with a light mitzvah even as one is with something that appears more stringent and more serious. And so therefore, to even talk about prioritizing one mitzvah over another or one value over another sounds to go in the face of what the Torah is all about and of what Yiddishkeit teaches. And yet, we find that our sages did that. If we think about the letter of the Ramban, of Moshe ben Nachman, he wrote an ethical will to his son, instructing him on how to live. Why didn't he? It's a famous letter in which he emphasizes the importance of humility, of yirat shamayim, fear of God, of the equality of all people, treating people with respect. Why did the Ramban, of Moshe ben Nachman, not just write to his children and say, keep all of Torah mitzvahs, just keep the whole thing? And when the Vilna Gaon wrote a letter to his family, when he was embarking upon the journey of making Aliyah, going to Eretz Yisrael, which in the end was unsuccessful, but he was expecting to be separated from his wife and children for a long period of time. In those days, you didn't just obviously get on a flight and arrive a few hours later. It was an arduous journey filled with many dangers, and he was going to be away for a long time. And he wrote a letter, a parting letter, to his children and to his wife, instructing how he felt the ethos of the home should be. And yet he could have just written, keep all of Torah mitzvahs and all of Shulchan Aruch, but he didn't do that. He wrote to emphasize certain things. For example, he spoke about the importance of how one speaks, not speaking, speaking with gentleness, speaking with kindness, respect in the family, the way that the children should respect their mother and their grandmother, and the relationships between all of the members of the family, the importance of avoiding jealousy and an over-focus on materialism. These are some of the issues which the Vilna Gaon discusses in his letter. What's more important perhaps than even the content of the letter is the fact that he wrote it. Because what the Ramban and the Vilna Gaon were teaching us, that there are certain values that do need extra emphasis. And even though one has to keep all of Shulchan Aruch, and there isn't even one sifkatan, even one tiny clause in all of the Code of Jewish Law that doesn't require our careful effort in application, Nevertheless, and notwithstanding that, there are certain values which are fundamental and at the core of the whole system of the Torah, and which we need to give particular emphasis to. Now, what are those values? And that's, in a certain sense, what this book is about. And what would give Rabbi Wein and I the right to set out values which we believe are core values? Nothing. What we write is what we receive from our Rebbeim, from our teachers. These were the values that our Rebbeim emphasized, our teachers emphasized to us, and this is part of the Masorah, the tradition that we received from this line of Litvishe Rabbonim, going back many generations, to say, this is the area of emphasis that one has to put in service of Hashem. And what are those? So we're going to discuss one or two examples this evening, but that's really what the book is about. So coming back to Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, he makes a radical statement. He says, it is possible to keep all of Tariq mitzvahs, all 613 commandments, and the entire Shulchan Aruch, and still be on the wrong path in life. Which sounds jarring in the extreme. How can anyone say such a thing? I mean, such a statement, as I said, if Reb Chaim had not said it, we would never have even thought it, let alone been able to articulate it in public, and yet he says it. And firstly, it's daunting, because it's hard enough to have to keep all of Shulchan Aruch and the Tariq mitzvahs, and now we say, well, that's not enough. So what is it? How do we make sure that we're on the right path? So his first piece of advice is daven, that we should daven to Hashem, that we are on the right path. Fine, and for sure that's part of it. But there is another dimension to it, and he says we have certain indications from our sources of what will be the litmus test whether we're on the right path or not. And these are some of the values which we write about in the book. For example, he says derech eretz, basic civility, basic etiquette, basic sensitivity, and kindness to other people. So what does that mean? He gives a perfect example of it. He says, if you see in the parasha, in Parashas Bamidbar, when Hashem instructs Moshe Rabbeinu to conduct the census, he tells him to count the children within the tribe of Levi. And that census was different from the other, because the other census was counting the men above the age of 20. So you have no problem there, you know how to count. But when you have to count the children, so how do you know how many children are in the house? And Hashem said you must count them yourself. You can't just rely on what people tell you. So that would have required Moshe Rabbeinu to go into the homes of the people to count their children. And he felt that was an invasion of privacy. That was something which would be a violation of basic derech eretz. So what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? He stood outside the tent, and a voice from heaven came and told him how many children were inside. But asked Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, he says, what right did Moshe Rabbeinu have to do that? If God told him to go count the children, and he said, don't rely on what people tell you, you have to go see for yourself. So how could he say, is he going to be frummer than Hashem? Is he going to be more righteous than Hashem? Hashem said, go count. But he knew, this is what Reb Chaim says, he knew that it would be impossible that Hashem would have given him an instruction which would have been a violation of the basic tenets of derech eretz, of basic decency. So he had to interpret Hashem's mitzvah in such a way that it would be consistent with the principles of derech eretz, of decency. A caveat, which is just an important safety catch on this statement, that there's no license here for us to become our own independent poskim and to decide when we're not going to apply the halacha, when we are depending on how we perceive the derech eretz. That we have great poskim and one has to refer to them. So it's kind of, they always say, don't try this at home on your own. The more important principle here, and this is what Reb Chaim is saying, we want to know whether the derech, the path that we are on, is a path that finds favor in the eyes of Hashem. It has to be a path of derech eretz. Why? Because the pasuk says, "Pekudei Hashem Yisharim," the statutes of God are yashar. What Rabbi Kimchi was referring to before, that value of yashrut, of straightness. Mesamchei lev, they bring joy to the heart. So the definition of Hashem's commandments is that they are yashar, yashrut. So this is what Hashem commanded, and He's describing His own mitzvahs in such a way And so says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, the minimum definition of Yashrus at the very least is derech eretz. That's the one thing. So he said, if you want to be able to test whether we're on the right path, that will be a very important indicator. Is the way of our Torah, and the way that our Torah is expressed, is it done with derech eretz? If it is with derech eretz, that's a very good indicator we're on the right path. If it's without derech eretz, then we should know we're already on the wrong path. Another indicator, the other description, we have derech darchei pasuk in Mishnah. The ways are ways of pleasantness. And Reb Chaim quotes from the Gemara in Sukkah, the Gemara in Yevamos, that actually uses this principle halachically. Meaning the Gemara in Sukkah, for example, is debating various species of branches, whether they could be considered to be used for the mitzvah of lulav on Sukkot. And it considers a particular branch, but disqualifies that branch because it's a branch which has thorns. And says, well, it cannot be that this is the way that the mitzvah is fulfilled, because it says, darchei noam, that the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness, and if it's got thorns, it's going to hurt the hands of the person who holds it, and therefore that branch is disqualified. So what Reb Chaim brings in that Gemara is that the concept of darchei noam is actually embedded into the halacha. It's embedded into the practical application of Jewish law. It's not just a vort, it's not just a cute idea, a nice idea, it's part of the halacha itself. And so therefore he says that in the same way that the way that we carry out our Torah and mitzvahs has to be with derech eretz, it has to be b'darchei noam, with ways of pleasantness. And if a person can say, but I'm keeping all of 613 mitzvahs, and come and show me one violation of Shulchan Aruch in something that this person is doing, but if it is a Torah without derech eretz, and if it's a Torah without darchei noam, then what Reb Chaim says is that is a sign that person is on the wrong path. He gives another test. And it's all of the tests that he uses in order to determine, to give us the tools with which to determine our own path, whether our own path is correct or not. It's all divrei Chazal. It's all the words of our sages. Famous Gemara in Yuma. Gemara in Yuma says, how do we fulfill the mitzvah v'ahavta l'Shem Elokecha? That we must love the Lord your God. Says the Gemara, sheyehei shem shemayim yisayv al yadecha. You should live your life in such a way that the name of heaven is beloved through you. That the name of heaven is beloved through you. Sheyehei shem shemayim yisayv al yadecha. So how do you make people love Hashem? It's a good question, because in Kiruv there are all kinds of different ideas. How do you do Kiruv? How do you bring people closer to Torah? So the Gemara in Yuma is saying a very clear way of doing it. It says, if you've got someone who has Kara Vashana, has learned Torah, has learned Chumash, and has learned Mishnah, and they are a person of learning and connected to Torah mitzvahs, and Masa or Umatano is Be'emunah, and their interaction with other people is with integrity and honesty. V'dibura b'nachasim abrias, and the way that he speaks is with gentleness to other people. Then ma'abrias omrim, what do people say? Then they say, Ashrei aviv shalamda Torah. How fortunate is such a parent who has raised a child to Torah likes. And says the Gemara on the contrary, if you've got a person who's learned Torah and has a connection to Torah and mitzvahs, and yet they do not deal with integrity and honesty and decency with people, and they don't speak gently to people, then people say, woe to a person who learns Torah, because look at the way this person conducts themselves. And so says Reb Chaim, from this passage in the Gemara in Yuma, from this Brisa, we see a very important test. If we want to test whether we're on the right derech or not, then we must say, is the way that we live something that inspires others to want to live in accordance with the Torah? That it causes that the name of heaven is beloved to other people. And he says, if we live in such a way that does inspire other people because of the integrity and the gentleness and the kindness and the honesty, well, then that's a sign that it's on the right path. But if a person lives in such a way that other people are not inspired by the way that we live our own lives, and on the contrary, it seems to put them off, well, then that is an indication that we're on the wrong path. And so again, he keeps on saying, a person can say, well, show me which passage in Shulchan Aruch where have I transgressed. Doesn't matter. He said it's possible to do all 613 mitzvahs and still be on the wrong path. His main proof for that, by the way, is from Yaakov Avinu, because Jacob, when he was coming to meet up with Esau, his brother, says he was afraid. And I said, why was he afraid? God promised him that he would return him home in peace, and he would return him home with blessing. He says, because he was afraid that he had sinned and lost the right to that promise. And yet, Reb Chaim points out that the Midrash says, Im Laban Garti V'Taryag Mitzvah Shamati, that Jacob proudly is that he kept the 613 commandments for all of the years that he was separated from Esau. So what was he worried about? Gemara says, Shema Garam Hachay, perhaps sin had caused. So he brings from there, it's possible to do all 613 mitzvahs and still be on the wrong path. And that's one dimension of the book, where it talks about certain key values upon which the entire system of the Torah is predicated. And if you take away those values, you don't even have Torah left. We mentioned that from Rav Aaron Kotler, who's going into he uses the Mishnah Pirkei Avos as the source for it. Imein Torah ein derech eretz, imein derech eretz ein Torah. But what Rav Aaron Kotler says is as follows, to explain that Mishnah. He says, if a person doesn't have derech eretz and midas Torahs and good character, then you don't say, well, they've got the Torah, but unfortunately they don't have derech eretz. He says is the absence of the derech eretz poisons the Torah, that it's not the right system anymore, because it's so, they're so bound up that you cannot separate the two. Because Imein Torah ain't derech eretz, and Imein derech eretz ain't Torah. The two are so intertwined that if you take the derech eretz out of Torah, you have nothing left. Also, by the way, if you take Torah out of derech eretz, you also don't have a proper derech eretz either. But the two have to go hand in hand. And so what the book puts forward is to say there are certain central and core values within Torah which are so central that without them, the system itself is no longer the same system. It's not identifiable as the Torah. You take out derech eretz, you take out darchei noam, ways of pleasantness. You take out kiddush Hashem and she'ei shem shemayim yisar al yadecha, that through you the name of heaven should be beloved to others. You take all of that out, you've got something that looks a lot like the Torah, but it's actually not anymore. It's only in form, and the heart of it has been taken out. But there's one other value which in a certain sense was at the heart and soul of so much of what these great Rabbonim taught, and that is the power of learning Torah to change the world. And that's what the Midrash says. Reb Chaim Volozhin quotes it on the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, that describes a Talmid Chacham as a Mayan HaMizgaber, as a spring of water that constantly overflows with continued vigor and strength. And Reb Chaim says the comparison to the overflowing spring is the fact that if you've got mud on the ground and it's dirty, if you've got a live spring of water that's pumping fresh water from the depths of the earth, then no matter how dirty it is on the surface, the fresh, clean water will pump through and clean it. And so he says, so too is it with the learning of Torah, in one's personal life and in the life of the klal. If we need purification, and we all do, the way that we ensure that we follow the right path in life, and that we stay close to Hashem, and we do what we need to do, both as individuals and as Klal Yisrael, is to ensure that there is fresh, clean, life-giving, pure waters of Torah pumping through the whole time. And that was the final example of the core values that I wanted to mention, which are mentioned in the book. The importance of saying that we don't just, that the Torah is not just a system, it's a system that has certain values at its heart, and it's those values at its heart that give life to the whole system and make it what it is.